Thank you for taking the time to listen to the story. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe to our channel. We appreciate it and thank you in advance. Please leave the name of the city you're listening from in the comments section below. It helps us see our reach in the community. Now, let's start the story. Mike leaned back in his well-worn recliner, his steel-toed boots propped on the scarred coffee table. Faint smudges of dirt and welding dust trailed beneath them, a subtle testament to another grueling day. The house was quiet, save for the hum of the TV, its glow flickering across the dimly lit living room. The air carried the faint tang of metal and oil, remnants of his trade. Welding was hard, honest work that demanded precision, focus, and an unyielding tolerance for long hours. 12-hour shifts were the norm, and his calloused hands bore the evidence of years spent bending heat and metal to his will. Those same hands were gripped tightly around the armrests, his attention locked on the chaotic images playing out on the screen. The news anchor's voice trembled, barely masking the fear in her tone as footage rolled in. Frantic crowds trampling one another, military convoys trapped on highways, and most chilling of all, pale, ravenous figures lurching through city streets. Their movements were jerky, their glassy eyes devoid of life. Mike leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, the flickering screen casting sharp shadows across his tense features. His chest tightened as he tried to process the unimaginable. This wasn't a movie or a conspiracy theory cooked up by the internet. This was happening. Unbelievable, he muttered, his voice barely audible over the distant wail of sirens outside. His pulse quickened, adrenaline sharpening his senses. For years he had joked about this moment. The so-called zombie apocalypse, a half-serious gag he and his friends had used to justify their survivalist tendencies. Mike had spent countless weekends prepping, stockpiling food, gear, and tools, building bug-out bags, and tinkering with his beloved 2006 Toyota Land Cruiser, just in case. But now it wasn't a joke. The chaos unfolding on the screen drove home a sobering truth. The world as he knew it was coming undone. The faint blare of sirens crept into the edges of his awareness, growing louder with each passing second. Mike knew what he had to do. He couldn't wait for things to blow over. This wasn't the time for hesitation. Grabbing his phone, he dialed his brother Chris. The line rang twice before Chris picked up, his voice tight with tension. "Mike, are you seeing this? What's going on?" "Yeah, I'm seeing it," Mike replied. "And I know what's next. Listen, we don't have time to argue. I'm heading to the cabin at Mount Hood. It's stocked and remote, perfect for laying low. You can meet me there if you can make it." Chris hesitated. "The cabin? That's like 2 hours from here. What if things go south before I even get there?" "Then you do what you have to," Mike said firmly. "But I'm going now. Pack light, stay off the main roads, and keep your head down. Call me when you're on the move." The line went dead before Chris could respond. Mike tossed the phone onto the couch and sprang into action. Mike grabbed his bug-out bag from the closet, double-checking its contents: a water filter, fire starters, a tarp, first aid supplies, and enough freeze-dried meals to last a week. Next, he moved to his tool chest, pulling out his trusty hammer, a pry bar, and a compact welding torch. Each item was chosen purposefully, a survivalist arsenal honed over years of preparation. He stepped into the garage, his eyes falling on the Land Cruiser parked like a fortress on wheels. The 100 series was his pride and joy, built to endure the harshest conditions. It was already loaded with extra fuel cans, a hunting rifle with ammunition, and enough gear to outfit a small expedition. Mike added the bag and tools to the mix, securing everything tightly. The radio on his workbench crackled to life as he tuned to a local station. The announcer's voice was shaky, his words punctuated by bursts of static, urging everyone to remain indoors. "Emergency services are overwhelmed and the National Guard has been deployed. Stay safe and stay tuned." Mike clicked it off with a grunt. "Yeah, sure," he muttered, wiping his hands on his jeans. He walked to the driveway's edge and paused, scanning the horizon. The streets of Hubbard, Oregon, were eerily quiet. A neighbor a few houses down was frantically loading suitcases into the trunk of a minivan, their movements jerky and panicked. Mike raised a hand in a small wave, but the gesture went unanswered. Everyone was in survival mode now. Mike turned back toward the house, his mind racing. Leaving immediately would have been ideal, but the day was slipping into night, and navigating unfamiliar roads in the dark didn't sit well with him. He decided to wait until dawn, using the remaining hours to finalize his preparations. Pulling the Land Cruiser into the garage, he closed the door and secured it tightly. The reinforced locks and thick wooden frame gave him a sense of security, though he knew it was fleeting. He double-checked the house, locking windows and drawing curtains before settling into the recliner again. The adrenaline hadn't worn off, but exhaustion was creeping in. Mike stared at the blank TV screen, his thoughts drifting to Chris. His brother was capable, resourceful even, but the unknown dangers between here and the cabin loomed large in Mike's mind. "You'll make it," he muttered, though the words felt hollow. The first morning light crept through the edges of the curtains, casting a pale glow across the living room. Mike stirred, his back aching from the hours spent in the recliner. He rose with purpose, the day ahead fueling his movements. The garage door groaned as it opened, the Land Cruiser humming to life as Mike started the engine. He loaded the last of his supplies, a cooler with water bottles and a thermos of coffee, before pulling out onto the driveway. The streets of Hubbard were still quiet, but the tension was palpable. Mike eased the Land Cruiser onto the road, the sturdy vehicle rolling smoothly as he turned toward the highway. His thoughts were sharp now, focused on the journey ahead. The cabin at Mount Hood was waiting, with it the hope of safety. But as Mike drove through the hushed streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that the world he left behind would never be the same again. The morning sun filtered through the dense clouds, casting pale streaks of light across the back roads. The wet pavement shimmered under the golden glow, but the scene's beauty was lost on Mike. His hands gripped the steering wheel of his 2006 Toyota Land Cruiser tightly, his knuckles white against the leather. The hum of the tires on the cracked asphalt was the only sound in the morning. The highways were chaos incarnate, he'd heard the reports. Gridlocked cars, desperate people fighting for scraps, and worse, those pale figures shambling among them. The back roads were his salvation, a quiet safety ribbon threading through the Oregon wilderness, for now. As he approached Molalla, Mike slowed the Land Cruiser, its engine purring low. The town sprawled ahead, an unsettling quiet hanging over it. Abandoned cars littered the parking lot of the Buy Mart, their doors gaping open as if the occupants had fled in a panic. Clothes, bags, and the occasional blood smear told a grim tale of what had happened here. Mike parked a safe distance away, cutting the engine. He slung his AR-15 over his shoulder, the cool weight of the weapon reassuring against his back. His machete hung from his hip, its sheath worn but reliable. He scanned the parking lot, every instinct honed and alert before stepping onto the cracked asphalt. The shattered glass doors of the Buy Mart crunched under his boots as he entered, his rifle raised. The interior was a wreck, shelves overturned, products scattered across the floor. A faint coppery smell lingered in the air, mixing with the scent of spoiled milk and something fouler. Mike swallowed hard and moved cautiously, his boots crunching debris as he navigated the looted aisles. He worked quickly, sweeping the aisles for anything useful. He reached the pharmacy aisle, thankful to find a small stash of first aid supplies, bandages, antiseptic cream, and a bottle of painkillers. He stuffed everything into his duffel and turned toward the ammo section, hoping against hope for something useful. The shelves were nearly bare, but Mike found a few boxes of .22 LR rounds and a lone box of .30-06 hunting rounds. He was shoving the ammunition into his bag when a faint noise reached his ears, a low and rhythmic scraping sound. His body went rigid. Mike froze, his breath caught in his throat. The sound grew louder and closer until it was unmistakable. Shuffling feet dragging across the linoleum floor. He slowly turned toward the source, his heart hammering in his chest. Emerging from the shadows of the far aisle was a figure, its head jerking unnaturally as it moved. Its grayish skin was mottled with dark veins, its eyes glassy and lifeless. Blood dripped from its slack jaw, leaving a gruesome trail behind it. Mike's pulse raced as he raised his AR-15, the reticle of the red dot sight lining up with the creature's forehead. "First one," he muttered to himself, steadying his breath. The zombie lunged suddenly, a guttural growl escaping its throat. Mike fired. The crack of the rifle echoed through the store, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet found its mark, and the creature crumpled to the ground in a heap. The shot's echo faded, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Mike trained the rifle on the fallen zombie, waiting for any sign of movement. When none came, he released a shaky breath and lowered the weapon. "Not so unbelievable now," he muttered, a grim smirk tugging at his lips. Outside, the parking lot felt even more ominous. He scanned his surroundings, the AR-15 ready in his hands. The world felt different now. This wasn't just a scavenger run, it was survival. He loaded the supplies into the Land Cruiser as quickly as possible, his eyes darting to the shadows. Mike climbed into the driver's seat with the sun climbing higher and turned the key. The engine roared to life, and he pulled out of the lot, heading southeast toward Colton. The memory of the zombie in the Bi-Mart stayed with him, a grim reminder of what lay ahead. The Land Cruiser rumbled steadily down the back road, the engine's hum filling the silence. Mike's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, his knuckles white against the worn leather. He glanced at the rearview mirror, as if expecting to see that creature from the Bi-Mart shambling after him, its lifeless eyes and jerking movements etched into his mind. He exhaled sharply, trying to steady his nerves. The rifle lay across the passenger seat, its barrel pointing toward the floor, the lingering smell of gunpowder still sharp in the air. His heart was still racing, the adrenaline coursing through him in waves that left his limbs trembling. He flexed his fingers one at a time, willing himself to calm down. "That was it," he muttered, breaking the silence. His voice sounded foreign, almost hollow. First one down. For years he'd imagined this moment. Talked about it, joked about it, and even planned for it. And in those plans, he was the calm, collected survivor who took things in stride, dispatching the undead like it was just another day. But reality had hit him harder than expected. The creature in the store had been too human. The way its head twitched, the sound of its guttural growl, it was nothing like the movies. Nothing like he'd imagined. Mike clenched his jaw, his thoughts spiraling. That thing was a person once. Someone who had a life, a family. He shook his head, rejecting the sentiment. That wasn't a person anymore. It was a threat, and threats needed to be eliminated. Still, the memory of its lifeless eyes staring into his as it lunged gnawed at him. He reached over to the center console, pulling out a battered thermos. The lukewarm coffee inside offered little comfort, but it gave him something to focus on besides the growing weight in his chest. He took a sip, letting the bitterness settle on his tongue before swallowing hard. "This is what you wanted, right?" he said to himself, his voice low and bitter. Zombie apocalypse, survival, living out the dream. But was it really? The dream had always been clean and exciting in his head. Him against the world, thriving while everyone else panicked. Now it felt dirty and raw. He wasn't thriving, he was surviving, and barely. Every sound made his shoulders tense. Every shadow on the road felt like it was watching him. A flash of movement on the side of the road snapped him out of his thoughts. He gripped the rifle instinctively, his eyes narrowing as he slowed the Land Cruiser. It was nothing, just a deer bounding through the trees. Mike exhaled, his breath shaky, and eased his foot off the brake. He realized then how deeply the encounter had rattled him. If one zombie had done this to his nerves, what would happen when, not if, he encountered a horde? Could he keep it together when he had to? "Get it together, Mike," he muttered, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He glanced at the AR-15 on the seat beside him, then at the machete strapped to his pack in the back. He'd prepared for this. Now it was time to act like it. Survival wasn't going to be clean or easy. It would be messy and brutal, and he needed to adjust to that reality fast. He couldn't afford hesitation or doubt. The first encounter was over, and he'd made it out alive. That was the important thing. He forced himself to breathe deeply, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly as he focused on the road ahead. The cabin at Mount Hood was waiting, and every mile he put between himself and the chaos of the towns below felt like a small victory. Mike reached for the thermos again, taking another sip of the bitter coffee. The taste anchored him. He was alive, and he had a plan. For now, that was enough. The quiet, winding road into Colton offered little comfort. Mike had always found solace in solitude, but this kind of silence was different. It was too heavy, too charged with the unknown. His encounter at the Buy Mart had shattered any lingering notions of the apocalypse as a dream scenario. Now, every rustle of leaves or distant branch crack felt like a warning. As the Land Cruiser crested a hill, the small town of Colton came into view. Twisted Firearms sat on the outskirts, its faded sign barely visible against tall evergreens. The store was exactly as Mike remembered it, an unassuming building with a gravel parking lot and a wide front porch that creaked under the weight of foot traffic. Only now was the scene eerily still. The metal security gate had been forced open, its frame twisted at an unnatural angle, and shards of glass from the display window glinted in the sunlight. Mike pulled the Land Cruiser into the lot, stopping far enough away to leave himself a clear line of escape if things went south. He shut off the engine and sat for a moment, listening. Nothing. No wind, no birds, no voices. Just the quiet hum of his own breath and the faint creak of the truck as it settled on its suspension. Mike grabbed his AR-15, checked the chamber, and stepped out. The gravel crunched softly under his boots as he approached the entrance. The interior of Twisted Firearms was a mess. Display cases were shattered, and their contents spilled onto the floor. Racks that once held rifles and shotguns were bare, stripped of anything easily carried. A faint metallic tang lingered in the air, a mix of blood and gun oil. Mike moved cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. He swept the aisles methodically, his AR-15 raised, ears straining for the faintest sound of movement. The first few aisles yielded nothing but debris and broken glass, but behind a counter in the back of the store, he found what he was looking for. The looters hadn't been thorough. Tucked away in a locked cabinet, untouched and waiting, was a stash of handguns. Mike broke the lock with a well-placed strike of his machete, loading the pistols into a sturdy carrying case with their magazines. His heart raced as he worked, but his hands remained steady. Behind the counter, he found another stash, hunting rifles overlooked in the rush. He grabbed boxes of ammunition, 9mm, 45 ACP, .308, and .30-30, and tossed them into a duffel bag. He also found a small stash of gun oil, cleaning kits, and a red dot sight still in its packaging, which he also put into the bag. As Mike zipped the duffel, a noise from the front of the store froze him in place. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a shuffling sound, like feet dragging across the floor. His blood ran cold. He slung the duffel over his shoulder and moved toward the source, his rifle raised. The beam of his flashlight illuminated the front of the store. Broken glass, empty cases, and then a figure. It was hunched and grotesque, its skin pallid and peeling. The thing staggered forward, its head jerking unnaturally as it caught sight of Mike. Its guttural snarl filled the silence, and for a moment Mike felt the same fear that had gripped him at the Buy Mart. But this time, he was ready. The AR-15 cracked, the shot echoing through the store. The zombie's head snapped back, and it crumpled to the floor, its body twitching before going still. Mike didn't wait to see if there were more. He sprinted for the exit, the duffel thumping against his back. The Land Cruiser's engine roared to life as Mike slammed the door shut, his chest heaving. He glanced back at the store, the darkened windows staring at him like empty eyes. The encounter had rattled him again, but he shoved the fear aside. The duffel bag and case of pistols sat on the passenger seat, a small victory against the chaos. As he pulled back onto the road, heading deeper into the wilderness, Mike tightened his grip on the wheel. The cabin at Mount Hood felt farther away than ever, but he was determined to make it. The morning was crisp and quiet as Mike drove back into Colton from the side road where he was parked. Mist rose from the wet asphalt of the winding back road. The Land Cruiser handled the bumps effortlessly, its tires kicking up dew spray from the overgrown edges. It was only day 3, but the world already felt different. Not unrecognizable, just off. The once familiar surroundings carried a weight of unease. The streets were empty, the kind of emptiness where you felt watched, where every shadow seemed to shift just out of sight. He took a deep breath, gripping the wheel tighter as the Colton market appeared. Mike pulled the Land Cruiser into the lot and parked it so he had a clear line of escape back onto the main road. He turned off the engine, its hum fading into the surrounding silence. The market looked almost normal from the outside. No shattered windows, no obvious signs of chaos. But Mike knew better than to let his guard down. He stepped out, AR-15 slung over his shoulder, machete hanging at his side. The air smelled damp, with a faint metallic tang from the lingering mist. His boots crunched softly as he approached the entrance, testing the glass door with one hand. It opened quickly, the faint jingle of the bell above it echoing eerily in the quiet. Inside, the market was dimly lit. Some shelves were still stocked, but others were picked clean, their contents scattered across the floor. A few boxes of cereal spilled their contents in one aisle, and an overturned basket of fruit lay rotting in another. Fresh, Mike muttered to himself. It looked like whoever had been here last hadn't been gone long. He moved quickly, keeping his rifle raised as he swept the aisles. There wasn't much left, but he managed to find. Mike tossed the supplies into his duffel, his movements efficient but quiet. He was halfway to the door when a sound froze him in place, a faint rustling from the back of the store. He crouched low, rifle aimed toward the noise, his finger hovering over the trigger. The seconds stretched unbearably, each breath sharp in his ears. Then, from behind the shelves, a raccoon darted out, its claws skittering on the tile as it bolted toward an open back door. Mike exhaled, his shoulders relaxing as he let out a quiet laugh. "Damn scavengers," he muttered, lowering his rifle. Back outside, the world felt lighter. The supplies weren't much, but they were enough to keep him happy. As Mike pulled out of the market lot and headed for the edge of town, a small group of people caught his eye. They were gathered around the front of the historic Colton Cafe, their nervous energy palpable even from a distance. The building's windows were covered with mismatched boards, and a few tables had been stacked outside as makeshift barricades. Mike slowed the Land Cruiser, stopping a safe distance away. He rolled the window down, one hand on the wheel and the other resting casually on his rifle. A man in his late 40s stepped forward, shotgun in hand, but pointed toward the ground. His wiry frame and cautious expression gave away his unease. "Can I help you?" he called, his voice edged with suspicion. Mike raised his free hand. "Just passing through," he said. "Thought you might need some supplies." The man hesitated, glancing back at the group behind him, a woman and two younger men. They looked tired but not desperate, not yet. "What's the catch?" the man asked. "No catch," Mike replied. "Just figured it'd do more good here than sitting in my truck." He stepped out slowly, keeping his movements deliberate as he grabbed his duffel. From it, he pulled. "This should help," Mike said, handing the items over. The man studied him for a moment, his expression softening. "Thanks," he said. "Name's Dale." "Mike," he replied with a nod. The group murmured their thanks as Dale handed off the supplies. The woman smiled faintly, though the wariness in her eyes didn't fade. Mike lingered momentarily, his gaze drifting to the boy peeking out from behind the cafe door. He couldn't have been more than 10, clutching a stuffed bear with one arm and a bottle of water with the other. "You're good people, Mike," Dale said. "Stay safe out there." "You too," Mike replied. He climbed back into the Land Cruiser, the group fading into the rearview mirror as he pulled back onto the road. The 211 Estacada Highway stretched ahead, winding through thick forests and rolling hills. The morning mist had burned off, leaving the air crisp and clear. The Land Cruiser rumbled steadily along, its tires rolling over the occasional branch or stray rock. Mike adjusted his rearview mirror, his mind lingering on the group at the cafe. They seemed hopeful, almost untouched by the harsh realities he'd already seen. He envied that hope, but knew it wouldn't last. The thought unsettled him. As the road curved, Estacada loomed closer. Mike tightened his grip on the wheel, his mind returning to the plan. Stick to the back roads and get to the cabin. Each stop brought him closer to his goal, but the shadow of uncertainty followed him at every turn. Early morning light filtered through the trees as Mike navigated the quiet streets of Estacada. The small town still carried an unsettling calm. The occasional abandoned car dotted the roadsides, its doors ajar, its contents spilling onto the pavement as if the occupants had fled in a hurry. Mike kept his AR-15 resting on the passenger seat, his eyes constantly scanning the road. The town felt fragile, too normal in some places and utterly broken in others. A toppled lamppost blocked one side street, while another road was eerily pristine, as though untouched by the chaos that had gripped the world over the last 3 days. He passed a few houses, their windows dark and boarded up. A stray dog darted across the street, pausing to look at the Land Cruiser before disappearing into the woods. It was a strange juxtaposition, the familiar mixed with the eerie. As Mike continued on Highway 211, the intersection with 224 came into view. The 76 gas station stood like a relic of normalcy, its orange and blue sign weathered but still intact. The lot was empty, except for a few scattered cars, but Mike slowed anyway, pulling into the station cautiously. Mike parked the Land Cruiser near a pump, leaving the engine idling. He stepped out, his AR-15 slung over his shoulder and machete on his hip. The quiet of the morning made every sound feel louder. The click of his boots on the asphalt, the soft hum of the gas pump as he inserted the nozzle. He scanned the area while the tank filled, his eyes darting to the shadows near the building. The station's windows were intact but smudged with handprints, and the door hung slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. A faint metallic smell lingered in the air, mingling with the scent of gasoline. The pump clicked off, and Mike capped the tank. He glanced toward the convenience store, debating whether it was worth the risk to check for supplies. The interior was dim, the fluorescent lights flickering sporadically. Shelves were knocked over, their contents strewn across the floor. A spilled soda stained the tiles, its sticky residue glinting in the weak light. Mike stepped carefully, his boots crunching on broken glass and loose candy wrappers. He moved quickly, sweeping the aisles for anything useful. As he reached the back of the store, a faint sound stopped him in his tracks, a low, wet gurgle. Mike froze, his grip tightening on the AR-15 as he turned toward the noise. From behind the counter, a figure lurched into view. Its skin was pallid and mottled, patches of gray peeling from its face. Its mouth hung open, emitting a guttural snarl as it locked onto him. The zombie staggered forward, its bloodied hands reaching out. Mike didn't hesitate. He raised the rifle, his breath steady as he squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the small store, the zombie's head snapping back as it crumpled to the ground. He exhaled, his heart pounding as he listened for any other signs of movement. The store remained silent, except for the hum of the flickering lights. Mike hurried back to the Land Cruiser, the supplies clutched in one arm, while the other kept his rifle ready. The encounter had been quick, but it left his nerves on edge. He tossed the supplies onto the passenger seat, glancing again at the gas station before climbing into the driver's seat. As he pulled back onto Highway 211, heading toward the open road again, Mike's grip on the wheel tightened. Each encounter was a reminder of how quickly things could spiral out of control. The Land Cruiser was his sanctuary, but even that felt fragile sometimes. The mountains of Mount Hood loomed closer now, a shadowy promise of safety. Mike pressed the accelerator, the engine's hum steadying his frayed nerves. For now, he was still moving forward, and that was enough. The town of Sandy came into view as the Land Cruiser crested a small hill, the faint morning mist lifting to reveal its quiet streets. Mike squinted at the sunlight reflecting off the storefront windows as he rolled into town, his hands steady on the wheel. The familiar sight of Joe's Donut Shop caught his eye, its bright red sign standing out against the muted tones of the buildings around it. His stomach growled at the thought of a powdered donut or one of Joe's famous maple bars. The truck slowed almost instinctively as he considered stopping. The glass windows were still intact, the shop's interior cloaked in shadow, but there was no sign of life or danger. Mike shook his head, forcing himself to refocus. "Not worth it," he muttered, easing back onto the gas. He couldn't afford to waste time, not with Mount Hood so close. The Land Cruiser rumbled past the shop, leaving the tantalizing smell of nostalgia in the rearview mirror as he merged onto Highway 26, heading east. The highway stretched ahead, flanked by towering evergreens and occasional glimpses of snow-capped peaks in the distance. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows across the road. The drive was peaceful, almost too peaceful, and Mike found himself gripping the wheel tighter, his eyes scanning the horizon for anything out of place. The roads were mostly clear, but abandoned cars appeared sporadically, some parked neatly on the shoulder, others angled haphazardly as if their drivers had fled in a panic. Each one told its own silent story, and Mike resisted the urge to stop and investigate. He had learned quickly that curiosity often led to trouble. As the miles passed, he felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. The open road had always been his escape, a place where the world felt manageable. But this wasn't an escape. It was a race against time. The cabin was waiting, but so were the unknown dangers lurking in the woods. Mike's boots thudded softly against the wooden floor as he stood in the center of the cabin, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. This cabin, nestled in the heart of the woods, was more than just a shelter. It was their meeting point, their sanctuary in times of trouble. His brother Chris was supposed to meet him here if things went south. They'd planned for it, a clear-cut, no-nonsense fallback plan. But as Mike scanned the room, his gut told him what he already feared. Chris hadn't made it. Still, he couldn't leave it at that. He had to be sure. Mike started at the door, crouching to inspect the floor just inside. The thick layer of dust on the boards was undisturbed, save for his own boot prints. He moved to the windows next, one by one, checking for smudges or scratches that might indicate someone had tried to peek inside. Nothing. "Come on, Chris," he muttered, his voice low. "You had one job." The pantry was next. Mike swung open the small wooden door, revealing shelves stocked with rice, beans, and canned food. He scanned the items quickly, searching for anything out of place. If Chris had made it here, he might have grabbed something before moving on. But everything was untouched, exactly as Mike had left it months ago. His frustration grew as he checked the sleeping loft. The cot was still neatly made, the small pile of spare blankets folded at its foot. The lantern on the nearby shelf was covered in a thin layer of dust, its wick untouched. "Damn it," Mike hissed, kicking the edge of the cot lightly. Chris hadn't made it here. He was sure of it now. The frustration and fear that had been simmering beneath the surface boiled over, threatening to consume him. He couldn't lose Chris. Not now. Not after everything they'd been through. Mike stepped out onto the porch, the cool night air hitting him like a slap. The faint scent of pine and damp earth filled his lungs as he descended the steps, scanning the clearing. If Chris had come, he might have left a sign outside, a message scratched into the wood, a marker on the trail. Something. He circled the cabin, flashlight in hand. Its beam swept over the thick underbrush and the trunks of nearby trees, searching for anything unusual. About 20 yards from the cabin, he found a patch of disturbed dirt near a boulder. His pulse quickened, but as he knelt to inspect it, he realized it was nothing more than animal tracks. Deer, maybe. His search expanded, taking him to the small trail that led deeper into the woods. Mike scanned the ground carefully, his eyes straining in the dim light of the rising moon. But there were no footprints, no signs of movement other than the natural scuffs of the forest floor. He stood, exhaling sharply as he looked up at the stars peeking through the canopy. Chris was out there somewhere, or worse, he wasn't. The thought sent a pang of guilt through him. They'd agreed on this plan, and Mike had done his part. Why hadn't Chris? Returning to the cabin, Mike locked the door behind him, dragging the heavy chest back in front of it. He dropped into the chair by the table, the lantern's flickering light casting long shadows on the walls. His AR-15 rested on the table, its cold metal a strange comfort. Chris's absence gnawed at him, but he forced himself to focus. Worry wouldn't solve anything. He had to prepare for the possibility that Chris had been delayed, or worse, that he wouldn't come at all. Mike leaned forward, pulling a map from his pack. He traced his finger along the route Chris would have taken from the city to the cabin. The highways were likely impassable now, clogged with abandoned cars and chaos. Back roads offered the best chance of travel, but they were slower and fraught with danger. If Chris was smart, and Mike knew he was, he'd stick to the plan as long as he could. That meant there was still hope. Mike folded the map and set it aside, his mind racing with possibilities. If Chris didn't show up by morning, Mike would have to make a decision. The weight of this decision pressed down on him, each option carrying its own risks and uncertainties. He could wait, fortifying the cabin and hoping his brother arrived. Or he could retrace the route, searching for signs of Chris along the way. The gravity of his decision was palpable, the consequences of each choice looming large in his mind. Neither option sat well with him. Waiting felt like gambling, but leaving the cabin meant risking everything he'd worked to secure. He let out a heavy sigh, running a hand over his face. "Come on, Chris," he whispered, the words barely audible. "Don't make me come looking for you." The night stretched long, and sleep eluded him as he sat by the window, watching the shadows shift in the moonlight. Tomorrow would bring answers, or more questions. Either way, Mike was ready. The sun had barely crept over the horizon when Mike slipped out of the cabin, AR-15 slung across his back along with a 30-30 and machete at his side. The crisp morning air carried the earthy scent of pine and damp moss as he stepped carefully onto the dirt trail leading into the forest. Before heading out, Mike crouched by the cabin's entryway, brushing away any traces of his presence. He swept the dirt road clear of his footprints and moved branches to obscure where he had passed. Keeping his trail hidden was the only way to secure the cabin. His destination was a hunting spot he'd frequented for years, a clearing near a shallow stream about 2 miles from the cabin. It was one of the few places that felt untouched by the chaos unfolding in the world below. He hoped it would offer both a game and a brief reprieve from his restless thoughts. The walk to the clearing was slow and deliberate. Mike moved through the dense underbrush with practiced ease, eyes scanning the trees for movement. The morning mist clung to the forest floor, muffling the sounds of his footsteps. He wasn't just hunting for food, he was also hunting for clarity, a chance to think without the weight of the cabin pressing down on him. The clearing opened before him, sunlight dappling the grass and the gentle stream trickle, providing a soothing backdrop. Mike crouched near the water, his rifle resting on his knee as he waited. Hours passed in patient silence, the kind that only a seasoned hunter could endure. By midday, he had bagged a small deer and a few rabbits, their weight manageable. The familiar rhythm of hunting had centered him, quieting the nagging worries about Chris. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky, he knew it was time to return. Mike approached the cabin just as twilight began to settle over the forest. His boots crunched softly on the dirt road as he neared the concealed turnoff. He paused, his eyes narrowing as something caught his attention. The dirt near the entryway had been disturbed. Faint but unmistakable tire tracks cut through the ground he'd carefully swept that morning. His pulse quickened. Dropping into a crouch, he examined the tracks. They were fresh, made of large, knobby tires. His heart raced as recognition dawned on him. These weren't just tracks, but from Chris's lifted F-350. Mike stood quickly, his rifle ready, moving cautiously toward the cabin. As he emerged from the trees, the sight of the truck parked in front of the cabin stopped him in his tracks. Its dark green paint glinted faintly in the fading light, the familiar shape a beacon of relief. "Chris," he whispered, his voice catching in his throat. Mike approached the cabin quickly but carefully, his rifle lowered but still in hand. The door cracked open, a faint glow spilling onto the porch. He pushed it open slowly, his eyes adjusting to the light. "Mike?" came a voice from inside, rough but unmistakable. Mike stepped in, and there he was, Chris, sitting at the table, a half-empty can of chili in front of him. His brother looked tired but alive, his dark hair disheveled and his clothes dirtied from the road. "Chris!" Mike exclaimed, relief washing over him as he set the rifle aside. The two brothers embraced briefly, a rare show of emotion in the face of everything they'd endured. "I didn't think you'd make it," Mike admitted, his voice thick. Chris gave a slight, weary grin. "Took a long way, but I got here. Thought I'd surprise you." The brothers sat at the table, the lantern glowing warmly as they shared their stories. Chris had spent the past few days fortifying his house and told the story of killing some looters who were trying to tear down his defenses and then having to scavenge supplies along the way to the cabin. He'd seen things that still made his hands shake. Desperate people, overrun towns, and more than a few close calls with the undead. "I almost didn't make it out of the city," Chris said, his voice low. Mike nodded, sharing his encounters. The zombie at the Buy Mart, the group at the Colton Cafe, and the eerie quiet of Estacada. "It's bad out there," he said simply. "But you're here now. That's what matters." Chris leaned back, his exhaustion evident but tempered by the comfort of safety. "Are you ready to set this place up?" he said, gesturing to get the supplies stacked neatly against the walls. "When I got here, I couldn't even tell that anyone was here." "I was hoping you would make it," Chris said. Mike smirked. "Always said you'd thank me one day." The two chuckled, the sound a rare but welcome break from the tension of the past days. Mike let himself relax for the first time in what felt like forever. His brother was here, the cabin was secure, and for now, they were safe.